Hello, and welcome to another episode of Heavy Hands. We've just been having a very long and drawn-out, on-topic discussion related to the things we're going to be talking to you about today. What are we talking about?
Violence.
Oh, violence.
And when it is usefully applied.
Yes, the violence we are here to talk to you about today comes in the form of Edson Barboza versus Justin Gaethje. Did I say welcome to Heavy Hands? This is Heavy Hands. We talk about MMA and UFC fights on this show. Barboza Gaethje is coming up ahead of us. That's in Philadelphia, this card. And looks like an okay card. And well, actually, it's got some weird low spots and some weird high spots for me. But we're also going to talk to you about some of the stuff that happened last weekend at what, frankly, in the aftermath feels like a fairly abysmal card. The UFC's return to Nashville, Tennessee. But just like the card before it, Till versus Masvidal, it ended with a very shocking, unexpected second-round knockout. So we'll get to that. Anthony Pettis' triumphant welterweight debut after getting into our upcoming lightweight main event. Edson Barboza, Justin Gaethje. Justin Gaethje is now, I think, 2-2 in the UFC, having lost to Dustin Poirier just before that comeback win over James Vick, exceeding some people's expectations. But if we think about Justin Gaethje when he first came to the UFC, this was the fight he asked for. The man he wanted to fight, first and foremost, was Edson Barboza. At the time that he initially brought that matchup up, I thought it's one of the harder matchups in the division for him. And now my perspective has somewhat changed. Phil, what do you think of Edson Barboza as a stylistic foil for Justin Gaethje?
I always kind of thought that Barboza was probably Gaethje's... He was one of Gaethje's easier style matchups.
That is how I feel now,
just because... Yeah, I mean, just because Barboza is bad when he's consistently forced backwards and Gaethje comes forward all the time.
Yeah,
and that's kind of it. Like, it just seems, and it seems like a troubling style matchup for him.
Yeah,
and so I guess from our perspective, what we should be looking at is, I think we both agree that this is a real tough one for Barboza, but I think it was actually useful last week when we talked about Pettis Thompson, is we talked about, how does Barboza win this one if he's going to win it? Because at the moment, he's had...
Hold on, Phil, I'm getting a call. It's the police.
Shocking.
They want to arrest you for having bad opinions. No, sorry.
My opinions are the best.
Okay. You were saying...
So, yeah, the thing is that when people have had defined forward pressure against Barboza, he has always been forced into backwards, and he has always started doing laps of the octagon.
Yeah.
And that is Justin Gaethje's MO. One of the things that keeps Gaethje honest is when he's fighting against big punchers. Barboza is not a big puncher.
Yeah.
How does, he rarely actually genuinely hurts people with his hands.
Yep.
And he can't kick going backwards. So the question really is, how does Barboza change the narrative of this fight?
Hail Mary flying knee?
Right. That does kind of seem like...
Right. The best way to go. You catch Gaethje getting behind his high guard, ducking down as he comes in, he walks into a knee. That's basically what it would have to be in my mind for Barboza.
Yeah. Okay, so I think there are some things that Barboza can do, which is, we've talked about this a few times with in terms of Gaethje's defense, is that he tends to be very catch and pitch focused.
Mm-hmm.
And so he tends to hold up the high guard, and then he just waits until you hit him hard enough that he's understood that now you can't, you're off balance enough that he can throw back.
Mm-hmm.
So this is one of the things I think Barboza can do, is that he needs his hands not necessarily to stop Gaethje from to like hurt Gaethje, to like literally back him off and fuck him up, like say Poirier did. But he needs to use his hands to get the guard up, and then he needs to kick Gaethje.
I think that's a good read. Yeah, it's very similar to fighting John Lineker. Like you need to keep a really active jab out there. I think that's the most important thing, is to just have the lead hand active and in his face so you can retreat behind it. But also, yeah, to get those responses, to find little bits of openings, and to just frustrate the offense. Like, the more you can get Gaethje to throw and miss on a counter, that's good. So jabbing, touching his guard, making him throw back and not being there, that would be good. But also, yeah, manipulating the guard in order to set up like body kicks.
Yeah, exactly. That is exactly what I'm thinking. So Barboza's switch left body kick. Mm-hmm. That's what he needs to be looking for, in my opinion, because that's the other problem with like a high guard, right? Is that you can just slip a body kick under his elbow. Other than that, like I said, it's just a problematic matchup for Barboza.
Yeah.
Gaethje is a bigger puncher. He's more durable. He's going to be willing to kick with Barboza, of course. So when Barboza tries to escape round the outside of the octagon, Gaethje will be able to kick his trailing leg. Mm-hmm. He's much more. He throws much more consistent offense in the clinch. Should Barboza stand his ground, I think Gaethje is a better clinch fighter. That's one of the reasons why he's able to storm forward the way he can, is that he's very good once he gets in close as well. Mm-hmm. So it sort of leaves Barboza in a bit of a quandary. And yeah, to my mind, he basically needs to really fight for every bit of space that he offers to Gaethje, because whilst he had a good performance against Dan Hooker last time out, it was, as we pointed out beforehand, a pretty good style matchup for him. It was a natural kind of counter fighter who was going to fence with him at range. But when Hooker forced himself to come forward and just throw combinations, you still saw Barboza reacting in the same way that he used to.
It basically just looked like the Ferguson fight.
Yeah.
Like, he was still getting all of his shots off. He was still landing his counters, hitting the body, doing all the stuff Barboza does well, but also getting pushed out of position, also getting hit a lot in return, also never really looking quite comfortable in the pocket exchanging. Yeah.
I will say, I am thinking about it. I am interested to see whether he can land, get the guard up and just body kick Gaethje, because it does seem like it would be a very good. I know we don't generally focus on like individual tactics that people can do, but the basic direction of this matchup is troubling for him, and I think that's kind of what you have to do when that's what a fight looks like.
Mm-hmm. What was Gaethje's really uninspired performance in World Series of Fighting? He had the Melvin Gillard one, wasn't great. Was it Luis Firmino? So he had a fight where he just got touched up with a jab over and over and over and couldn't deal with it. It might have been Luis Firmino.
Yeah, I think it might have been. He fought him twice, didn't he? And one of them was
No, that was Luis Palomino.
Oh, that was Palomino, sorry.
Yes, there. Names aren't even remotely similar, Phil. How dare you?
Oh, God damn it. Now I...
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you. But to me, Barboza has made small technical improvements throughout his career. But he is who he is. And I feel like I know exactly how he responds to this kind of style matchup. Having seen him, I mean, frankly, I feel like we should be concerned for Edson Barboza's health given this fight. Because his last, I don't know, Khabib and Kevin Lee, Dan Hooker didn't let him off very easy either, but he had two of the most brutally one-sided beatdowns in history in his last three performances. And this strikes me as just a more stand-up. I mean, I guess that's the thing in his favor here. It's a stand-up version of that same kind of stylistic matchup. So at the very least, Barboza is going to get to spend a lot more time on his feet, most likely. Although, let's be honest, if Justin Gaethje decides to use his wrestling, that wouldn't be a bad idea either. And he can be quite a good wrestler when he actually tries.
Yeah, we've said that about literally all of his UFC fights, and
Yes.
he has ignored us every single time.
What changed? He used to do that. He did used to take people down, and like he had lots of cool like clinch to strike transitions.
He's just worried. Apparently, he's just worried about running out of gas.
I guess. I don't think that ever seemed like a concern for him before, because he was always exhausted by the end of his fights. He was always exhausted by the end of the first round. He just kept going.
Yeah.
But I guess it's maybe a difference in the UFC where everyone has top-notch conditioning. But like realistically, I look at this matchup, I see, yes, Barboza's going to have opportunities, but the broad picture is he's not comfortable standing in range. He doesn't have tight angles in his footwork. He doesn't keep a really active jab out there in that way. Like everything is too dynamic for Barboza. All the movements are too big. Every backward step has to be a fully committed movement that you can't do anything else off of it. You have to then dig your feet in and spring back forward if you're going to fire off of your own retreat. And it's difficult to do that to begin with against Gaethje, but given the opportunity to fire off the back foot, Barboza tends to become more and more passive as the fight goes on. He becomes more and more locked into the pattern of just retreat, get to the safe distance, and can't ever find the opening to throw. And then, every time he does, he gets hit. So,
I will say that American Top Team are generally very good at teaching that to their fighters. In terms of,
well, that's right. He switched, didn't he?
What's that?
Did he switch camps?
Yeah,
I forgot.
Yep. So, and they're generally, if one of the things they are very good at is, teaching tighter footwork, better kind of punching mechanics in the pocket, all the things that he should need.
True.
For this fight, they are actually very good at teaching. It's just a question of, how much can you really change Edson Barboza at this point?
Yeah.
And he has apparently been training with Dustin Poirier and getting a lot of advice from him on how to fight against Gaethje. All good stuff. It's just, how much does someone really change? And, we've seen Barboza too many times come out and look like Barboza and beat the people he should beat and lose to the people he should lose to.
Yeah. Well, too little, too late is the feeling I have to go with if I'm making a pick here. It has to be Justin Gaethje. All right. Before we wrap up this segment, do we want to get into one of the other fights? Because we have a women's strawweight bout on this card that is pretty interesting to me. Karolina Kowalkiewicz versus Michelle Waterson. Let me quickly remind myself. That's right. Karolina's not fought since she was handed a knockout of the year contender by Jessica Andrade. And Michelle Waterson is like doing okay kind of in the division right now. So it's a question of, to my eyes, this looks like a matchup where it's like Waterson's momentum against what would otherwise be quite likely a really tough style matchup for her. She's coming into a tough fight with good momentum. The question for me is that enough to pick Michelle Waterson over Karolina Kowalkiewicz? How do you feel about it?
Yeah, it's a tricky one for me because Waterson is much less she's the much less consistent fighter, even if she's the one with the better record.
Yeah.
In that she is one of these fighters who's kind of cobbled together from a bunch of different techniques. Tend to be typically very dynamic. She's she's a good kicker. She's a fairly Jackson Wink stand-up fighter.
Mm-hmm.
Like quite, not much of a combination puncher, not really much of a puncher at all. She's a good kicker. She's got sneaky takedowns, I would say, rather than good takedowns, and she's a really dynamic submission grappler.
Mm-hmm.
So she's just like not the basic building blocks aren't particularly impressive, but she has a game that's probably a little more than the sum of its parts, and she's the better athlete of the two. Whereas Karolina Kowalkiewicz is pretty much just, she's going to punch a whole lot, and then if you take her down, she's going to try and stand up, and then she's going to go back to punching you a whole lot. Like, she really is the Bisping of the division.
Yeah. In this case, though, like, I'm feeling strong parallels to the main event. where like Waterson's style, like all Jackson Wink kickboxing styles, is really effective if you stand around and wait to see what she's going to do next. But if you pressure her, you start to demand a lot of her footwork. And I think Karolina Kowalkiewicz is very likely going to pressure her. That's the style that she has fallen into more and more as her career's gone on. Like Justin Gaethje, she can afford to just crash forward after opponents because she's better than the vast majority of them in the clinch. I have no doubt that will be true here. She's physically pretty strong, and does actually seem to have decent power when she gets her hands on people as well. So, like, I feel a similar dynamic to the Barboza fight where Waterson's style is really most effective when she is granted a sort of fencing match in open space. And she could absolutely win that kind of fight. Kowalkiewicz is no Rose Namajunas when it comes to her outfighting technique. But, if Kowalkiewicz is walking her backwards constantly and pressuring her and cutting off the cage, how does Waterson deal with that effectively?
Yeah, so my worry for a Kowalkiewicz win is not necessarily the stand-up, because I think she's just got a volume edge, which I think Waterson would struggle with a great deal. Mm-hmm. It's more the rest. It's more the grappling. That I think she has a very strong base, I think, which will help her out here.
Yes.
Is that she's in clinch situations, she's very, very tough to take down. We saw that against Rose. Rose just kind of exhausted herself going for takedowns on Karolina and just being completely unable. And I think that'll probably insulate her a good deal. I do worry about, her tendency to just prioritize scrambling back to the feet at all costs, Bisping style. Because, going back to the Gaethje fight, she got taken down and submitted almost immediately.
Yep.
That she just... but in general, I think I consider, Felice Herrig to be a better wrestler than Michelle Waterson. Uh-huh. And I'd probably consider even the version of Rose that fought Kowalkiewicz to be a better clinch wrestler. She's more physically powerful.
Uh-huh.
And because Waterson's takedowns all come from the clinch, I think Kowalkiewicz can probably insulate herself there.
Yeah, I tend to agree. And Waterson's she's real dangerous on the ground. She got a quick ass back take on Paige Van Zandt, so I guess I can't write it off. And that was Kowalkiewicz's problem against Gaethje. She scrambled, immediately bellied down, and gave up her back. Just like GSP against Bisping, Gaethje was perfectly ready for that response, already prepared to leap onto the back and sink the choke in. So Waterson can do that kind of stuff, but she doesn't have Gadelha's wrestling. She's one of the most diminutive fighters in the division to begin with. And then, I don't see how she has a good technical response to being walked down as someone who is a kicking specialist and who, like all Jackson Wink strikers, basically only ever throws one strike at a time. And just doesn't have great footwork. So I got to go with Kowalkiewicz here. I mean, I like Waterson's momentum. Michelle Waterson's, they both seem like very nice ladies. But I just think Karolina is she's an IQ test kind of fighter. She's not a particularly complicated style, but she does what she does very consistently. And I don't see Waterson having the right tools to handle it. So I think it's just a high percentage round winner against a low percentage, a more low percentage finisher. Yeah. So I think there's definitely, Waterson has a much better chance of finishing Kowalkiewicz, but over 3 rounds, I think I like Karolina. Yeah, that's the big difference between Karolina and Gaethje. If I'm still holding on to that parallel, is that Karolina is a lot less likely to finish the fight in an instant than Gaethje is. So yeah, Waterson being the dangerous finisher of the two does change the dynamic a little bit, but still, it seems like a pretty small hope to sort of hang your hat on. So let's take a break, Phil. When we come back, let's see, what else are we doing from this card? We've got, oh my God, I almost forgot. We're going to talk about Shayma Moraes and Sodiq Yusuff, but after that, Kevin Holland is fighting Gerald Meerschaert.
Fuck yeah.
The middleweight god returns to the octagon, and we are very, very excited to talk to you about it. All of that, as well as our recap of Wonderboy Thompson versus Pretty Tony Pettis after this.
Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out, the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it.
Welcome back to Heavy Hands. We are continuing on through the undercard of the UFC, Barboza versus Gaethje, and that means talking about what may be, I think, a sort of overlooked fight between two hot prospects on the opening slot of the main card. Well, I don't know if we can call Sheymon Moraes a hot prospect anymore, but he certainly filled that category and still is, promising, super athletic, violent fighter. Still very much worth seeing. And has gotten some of his momentum back recently, especially with that most recent win over Julio Arce. And he's taking on Sodiq Yusuff. And I think that's probably part of the reason this bout's going overlooked. A lot of people I've spoken to don't seem to know who Sodiq Yusuff is. Which I get, because he had a Contender Series fight. And then while it was exactly the kind of performance Dana White wanted out of him in his UFC debut, we didn't get to see much of him in his UFC debut. What is your read on Sodiq Yusuff as a fighter? Assuming that most of our listeners have some idea of who Sheymon Moraes is, how would you describe Sodiq Yusuff, Phil?
He looks just very well put together. Like, he looks like a fighter with just a lot of potential. I think he's already clearly a well-schooled fighter, but he's also extremely athletic. So wouldn't class him as a huge combination puncher or like aggressive fighter. He tends to kind of wait and feel out the rhythm of his opponents. He likes to sort of get a physical read on his opponents as well, I suspect. He initiates a lot of his fights with the clinch. But yeah, he just seems like a very well-schooled fighter everywhere, and, backs that up by being just clearly physically extremely impressive. Yeah. So he's like no real flaws anywhere. I think the only issues we're looking at the moment are just going to be in, depth and experience.
Yeah, and that's the main thing. Like, I agree with your read entirely. A very athletic, very well-schooled fighter. Literally the only thing I don't like about Sodiq Yusuff, and unfortunately it's a big one, is I'm pretty sure he's a Lloyd Irvin dude.
Yep, I was going to say that. Fuck Team Lloyd Irvin.
Yep. So fuck those guys, but all the same, he looks like a really promising fighter. And I think, like, if you had to compare him, as you sort of did before, Phil, to like another member of the current crop of newcomers, like, he reminds you of Jeff Neal, who comes in and we're like, this guy has lots of potential. How good is he really? And it turns out very, very good. It turns out, like, understanding how to control pace and move, understanding how to manage distance, staying extremely calm and poised under pressure. Like, those are really, really good attributes to bring in as a young fighter, even if you don't have much experience. Like, you could perhaps say, it looks like Yusuff is coming into this fight with Sheymon Moraes possessing qualities that Moraes had to kind of learn the hard way and may not have fully internalized even now. But there's still a huge experience edge on the side of Sheymon Moraes. And unfortunately, looking at Sodiq Yusuff's record, like, he's fought very respectable competition for a guy who's, I don't know, what is he, 7-1, 8-1, something like that? But, like, he just hasn't fought anyone. It's respectable competition for his level. But the thing is, he looks like he's performing beyond his level right now, and we have never seen him fight someone beyond this level. Like, I don't know about you, Phil. I don't rate a win over Suman Mokhtarian all that highly as a UFC debut opponent.
No.
So, to me, the main concern here is, and this may come across as very obvious, Sheymon Moraes is wrestling and grappling. Those Lloyd Irvin guys tend to be pretty good grapplers, but I haven't seen Yusuff really have to deal with a lot of that. He gets slammed, knocked out by Luis Gomez, which isn't a great sign. But otherwise, I haven't seen him deal with any like similarly athletic fighters who can take him down. And that speaks well of his takedown defense and his distance control. But Sheymon Moraes could probably get to the clinch and take him down.
Yeah, I think we've seen Moraes use his ground game a little more in the UFC since that loss to Zabit. So I think it was his next fight after that where we saw a little more of his takedown game. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I suspect. I mean, so we've got to put this into perspective. Is that this shouldn't even be a particularly like compelling matchup. Someone who's gone from Suman Mokhtarian to Sheymon Moraes, yes. It shouldn't really be a question.
Yeah.
Because Moraes is only 11-2, but he was thrown in the deep end very, very quickly.
Right.
He was fighting, Marlon Moraes in WSOF. So in general, I think it's also just a question of, it's just going to be a question of depth everywhere. I suspect is the issue. They are two very similar fighters. Like in the terms of the strikes they both have very like clean, accurate right hands. I just think that Sheymon Moraes is more threatening on the ground and is just. We saw against Julio Arce, for example, I thought if Sheymon Moraes won that fight, he would still get pressured a lot, and he would still probably have to walk through a lot of Arce volume, and he kind of didn't.
Yeah,
he was just able to snipe Arce whenever he came in, put him on his butt with counter right hands. He didn't really take much damage in that fight at all, and much more impressive than Yusuf's win over Mokhtarian was his Contender Series fight against Mike Davis, mm-hmm. an insanely huge and also rather athletically gifted.
Another seemingly very athletic, well-schooled up-and-comer.
Yeah, someone who I would. Does he have a UFC contract? I would certainly expect to see him in the UFC at some point. But
I don't think he got one out of that, but he was a guy who, if he had been fighting someone other than Yusuf, it would be very easy to see him getting one.
Yeah. I would also like to see him at lightweight because 6 foot tall, bricked up lightweight. I mean, featherweight is just dumb.
Yeah, not like either Moraes or Yusuf are very lean or small for the division either. But
yeah, so Yusuf he picked up on a speed advantage that sort of tired Davis out as the fight went on. But you saw how composed he was for his relative lack of experience. But I think it's just going to be a depth fight here.
Yeah,
and hopefully he can get a much more appropriate fight after this. Admittedly, this will put him on if he loses this fight, it will put him on you lost your first fight in the UFC damnation train. But, which is incredible. It means the UFC is incredibly unlikely to ever pay attention to you ever again. But I still think it will, he'll probably have a good accounting for himself, but it's just a fight that he's not quite ready for yet.
Yeah, I tend to have the same feeling. It's an interesting dynamic because Moraes did surprisingly well off the back foot against Arce, but from what I can tell, Yusuf seems to like playing more of a counterpunching game. Mm-hmm. He seems perfectly comfortable backing up. There were moments in that Mike Davis fight where he was getting into Tyron Woodley territory a little bit.
Yeah.
But I kind of got the impression that he was doing that so regularly because he could get away with it, because he really cut down Davis's volume a lot as that fight carried on, and that's when he started to kind of just bait him and draw him into counters. And when Davis was actually putting the pressure on, he did show a few times he was able to get off the fence and get back to open space or press forward. But I'm interested to see how Moraes deals with that. The thing is that Moraes, probably unlike many of the other fighters Yusuf has fought, is also comfortable and dangerous in the clinch, much more so than anyone else he's ever fought, is also a very powerful kicker, has a lot of options to use if he is given the initiative in a matchup. So I expect that to basically be a lesson that this fight will have to teach Yusuf, because he hasn't had to learn it before, that you back up against an equally athletic opponent with better long-range weapons. They're not going to lose all their volume and just sort of hesitantly let you counter them like Mike Davis more or less ended up doing in that fight. Moraes does not respond that way to frustrating circumstances. He's just going to take whatever Yusuf gives him, and if he wants to at any moment, he can probably charge forward, threaten a takedown, or at least tie up and land some elbows. So I agree. A depth fight, it's one I'm excited for, and I just want to emphasize the point you made before. Like any other 8-1 fighter, for the most part, any other 8-1 fighter, it would be really, really easy to pick Sheymon Moraes over them. Like Matt Sales, the guy he fought after the fight with Zabit, was also like a well-schooled, good-looking fighter, and didn't have like the kind of athleticism that Yusuf has, and just like he was very competitive. He fought a very respectable performance, but very clearly lost. And it's like, yeah, of course, Sheymon Moraes is going to beat these guys. So the fact that that I can imagine a scenario in which Yusuf wins this fight is makes it really interesting to me. I guess we have to give them a little bit of slack, because I was also just going to repeat what you said before. Like, it sucks for his first UFC fight, but I forgot about Suman Mokhtarian.
Oh yeah, of course.
that very important learning experience that Sadiq Yusuf had against the guy who did nothing and then got knocked out in 2 minutes. So yeah, it's bound to be a learning experience, but Yusuf looks super poised and calm, and like he knows he has answers to whatever problems his opponents are posing, and I love to see that out of a young, inexperienced fighter. So, good shit. Final fight from this card, though. Speaking of good shit, Kevin Holland finally returns. It feels like it's been an eon since his last fight, Phil. I've missed him so dearly. That was it the loss to Thiago Santos?
Oh, he won his last fight, didn't he? And it was also
that's
hilarious.
Right, John Phillips. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, he hilariously beat the guy who just stunk out the joint against Jack Marshman last weekend. So, Kevin Holland returns. A man whose fights are never quite as interesting as the many, many conversations he's having in the midst of them, is fighting Gerald Meerschaert. And boy, if it isn't a middleweight fight, Phil. I just don't even know what to say about this. Like, what is the style matchup here?
Noodly man against weird finisher.
Yes. Noodly man against guard submission artist.
Yeah, like, I'm not sure how I feel about Gerald Meerschaert, because he's, like, I sort of thought of him as being something of a opportunistic, sort of an opportunistic, big, slow grinder guy, but he really is a kill or die finish machine.
Yeah.
Like, his last fight, win or loss, that wasn't a finish was against Sam Alvey back in 2014.
He has only ever won 2 decisions and lost 1 decision. He's only gone to decision 3 times in a 38-fight career.
Yeah, so I don't know where I got that image from, probably just from looking at him.
Yes.
That he was just this. But yeah, he's a surprisingly good finisher, surprisingly hard hitter, he's had the body kick against Spicely. Like, he's a dangerous dude everywhere.
Yep.
He's also, like, really slow.
Yep. I think that probably had something to do with this guy probably doesn't finish people impression. That he is as slow as Pat Healy, but much more dangerous.
Yeah. So in this way, I feel like this is a dangerous fight for our boy, Kevin Holland.
Yeah.
Because Kevin Holland isn't really any good anywhere. And he sort of tends to get put into bad situations because of that, and then rely on just noodling his way out of them whilst talking random shit.
Yeah.
And Meerschaert is actually a really dangerous offensive fighter in multiple places. So it is actually a pretty sneakily tough matchup for him. He should have a major speed edge, but I'm not sure how he can necessarily use it, because he's not a tremendous boxer, or really much of anything. But he's basically going to be stuck contending with Meerschaert's kicks at range, and if he ties up with him, I suspect Meerschaert might be he's much more dangerous either from his back or from top position than Kevin Holland is. So I think I'm just going to have to pick Kevin Holland.
Thank God you did it. I really thought you were walking towards a Meerschaert pick there.
What? No. I refuse.
I was actually looking forward to it. I was like, finally I get to shame Phil for picking the wrong guy.
Oh, come on. There's degrees of being a monster. I'm just not willing to stoop that low.
Sorry, I just got distracted. I'm watching Kevin Holland's fight with John Phillips, where he appears to hit Phillips cleanly and then fall down for no reason. He's incredible. Yeah, I don't know, like, there are things he does well, Kevin Holland, like quite a lot of things. I guess the defining characteristic is, and this is really important against Meerschaert, because as you said, Meerschaert's slowness, all that, it gives the impression of being someone who must be a grinder, but he does not approach fights with a grinder style. You know, we saw that very clearly in his loss to Jack Hermanson. Like, he was losing that fight, and at no point did he think, I should get on top position and slow this down. He kept pulling guard.
Yep.
Because he was like, well, he's about to finish me. I can maybe finish him while he's doing it. That was his thought process. And that's how he fights. And I think that works to his advantage, because Kevin Holland's defining characteristic is being really slippery. Like he's so weird in how he fights that, like, you look at him and you're like, this is bad defense. But then he doesn't really get clean all that often by the people who are like standing in front of him while he's feet planted back against the cage, just shoulder rolling and shelling up. And he's not that easy to hit. You know what I mean? It doesn't look like it should be working, but he's really, really slippery. He's got like a weird, like, Bobby Green kind of thing going on. Where
okay, I'm also watching the Phillips fight in the background, and he just hit Phillips with a 2-slap combination.
Hell yeah.
And then body kicked him and fell over, then stood up and high-fived him. He's the greatest.
Yes, also he's constantly making friends with the people he's fighting. Just in the midst of the fight. So it's a confusing experience to fight Kevin Holland. And he has that going for him. He's slippery. He's hard to finish. We looked this up before as well. He's only been finished once in his career. It was a submission, but it was to Rafael Lovato Jr. And it was like a minute and a half, like, you know, like an incredibly good submission grappler. So I don't know if that really supposes that Gerald Meerschaert is A, going to be able to get him down, B, going to be able to finish him when he gets in there. You know, this is a guy who survived on his back underneath Thiago Santos for what felt like an eternity and was mostly just having a conversation with his corner while it was happening.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't expect Gerald Meerschaert to finish him. It's just kind of round winning offense. I just worry that he'll get stuck on bottom for long periods. Is my main fear. It
could be, but Meerschaert's not much of a wrestler. Holland does a lot of moving, and he does keep up a pretty damn high output himself. So I think there's actually a decent case here for Kevin Holland being the more round winning fighter against someone in Meerschaert who is just pathologically hunting for the finish. But it's Kevin Holland, and frankly, even though both you and I love him and would die for him, I don't think either of us really knows how good he is. So we're still finding out how far the Kevin Holland train can take us. But boy, am I here for the ride. All right, very much looking forward to that one. I might just watch that fight and and just catch the entire rest of the card later. I'm so much more interested in that than I am in Barboza Gaethje. I can't wait. Okay, so that's segment 2. When we come back, we're going to get into our recap for this week's episode. Anthony Pettis knocked out Stephen Thompson in shocking fashion, a knockout in which both men were in midair. Is just an extremely MMA kind of thing to happen. And some other stuff happened on that card too, and we will get to all of it after this.
Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are one or two of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. You can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show.
All right, welcome back to Heavy Hands. We are talking about last week's card. Anthony Pettis knocked out Stephen Thompson.
And the rest of it was garbage.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Of course, my boy Cheeto Vera got a win on the prelims and hit Frankie Saenz in the back of the head a billion times. We won't talk about that. But the big story is Pretty Tony knocking out Stephen Thompson. Your take on the fight, Phil? The narrative I have seen most of after this is that Pettis was getting wrecked and then got a Hail Mary knockout. My read is more kind of in line with what our prediction was, that it was a matchup that was slightly worse for Anthony Pettis, and he was losing, but was doing a lot of the right things, and then knocked Stephen Thompson out.
Yeah, because I think, we obviously didn't call this, but I think we captured a bunch of the right dynamics about this fight. So when I looked at this performance from Pettis, the thing that really stuck out to me is that it was a very candid performance. Like, it was very much, it looked like a recognition of what Anthony Pettis' flaws are. And, how, because I've seen some criticism of kind of how he fought the fight, but
the only criticisms you can level at him are ones that you could level at him in every other fight. Like, yeah, his footwork was still worse than Stephen Thompson's, but in terms of what he did with the style he's built for himself, he made a lot of the right calls.
Yeah. So, yeah, this is the thing, is that you look to him, you're like, within the context of this guy, who is incredibly tough, a very good kicker, has almost no striking defense, and has terrible footwork. Like, this was the fight which would give him the best chance of beating Stephen Thompson.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he did a pretty good job of it. Like, as far as it could have been, because he absorbed a fair few strikes from Wonderboy, mostly punches, and he was just always going to. Like, he had two options, and one of them was just to go nuts with something insane and try and knock Wonderboy out, just because he wasn't ready for it. Or he could try and break him down. And in the end, attempting to break him down opened him up a bit for something completely insane.
Yeah. Pretty much. I think you very specifically pointed out that you would like to see Pettis work the legs last week.
Yeah. So, I mean, the whole thing, even his stance looked more like a Thai style stance than it normally does. He had he held the high guard a lot of the time,
mm-hmm.
just ready to absorb punches and come back with kicks. It actually, the way the stance is played out, it really reminded me of actually Shogun Machida.
That is exactly what I thought of when I was watching this. I even thought of their second fight once the knockout had occurred. Because I remember, you have my favorite read of the rematch between Shogun and Machida, which is that knockout of Machida is a big part of what prevented us from seeing how washed Shogun was at the point.
Yeah.
And this was Anthony Pettis is, in a lot of the ways that Shogun was, kind of washed. His body's breaking down. And he's having to invest a lot more in being, having a strong chin and hitting really hard in single moments. He's basically undergoing a very similar stylistic transition. But for the performance he got here, it made sense. He got Stephen Thompson to collide with him whenever he could. And otherwise he was doing what Shogun did to Machida in their first fight, which was just chop his legs away every time he tries to exit range. It was like Anthony Pettis doing a Justin Gaethje impression. He did seem to have come into this fight knowing that what I should do is work towards a finish. And in order to do that, I'm going to have to absorb some shots. So I should keep a high guard, shell up as best I can, and look for every opportunity to break him down. And then just periodically, and the breaking down, because it was a Superman punch that was the finishing blow, like breaking him down via leg kicks explicitly set up the finishing shot as well. So it was it was a gambit, but it was always going to be. That's why we picked Stephen Thompson. Anthony Pettis was going to get hit a lot. He didn't have the defense or the footwork to win rounds in that kind of fight with Stephen Thompson.
You know what it also reminded me of? It reminded me of the Rick Rufus against the Thai guy. He was called, I think, wait a minute, let me look it up. Changpuek Kyatsongret. This was the big thing of American kickboxing against Thai kickboxing. And that Rufus back in, when was it? Must have been the 90s. But he basically, 1988. So, and this was the American high percentage, not high percentage, the American kind of flashy kickboxing style, which kind of focused on, setting up head kicks and was much more kind of traditional martial arts focused than, Rick Rufus didn't believe in leg kicks, basically, was the narrative back then, against the Thai guy and the fight starts and Rick Rufus just fucks the Thai fighter up, Changpuek, and I think he broke his jaw actually, but as the fight goes on, the Thai guy just breaks him down with leg kicks and ends up TKOing him. And it's kind of cool to see that the echoes of that coming down, through Duke Rufus to Pettis himself, doing kind of the same thing in reverse. He's learned
vicariously learning his lesson.
Yeah, it's learned, internalized, and turned around. He was the flashy guy, and then he just fights this real, simple, pared down, damage absorbing, you're going to hurt me, but I'm eventually going to hurt you more kind of style.
Yep.
And I don't know if it would have worked if he hadn't pulled that giant Superman hook out. And I have to say, I did burst out laughing when that happened.
I'm mostly in surprise, of course. You're not an evil man, Phil. You were just surprised.
Oh, yes. But, it was a good performance, I thought. He gave himself the best possible chance he had. And we did see, why things like turning side kicks and so on and back kicks are quite so dangerous, because they're a sort of, fat tail risk kind of problem in that it's pretty difficult to counter a pushing kick. It's, because you kind of have to go through it in order to do so.
Yeah.
But if you do, for whatever reason, if you can either parry it or step around it, or, it just doesn't hit cleanly, the person throwing the kick is often in very, very bad trouble. Because Thompson was standing absolutely side on to Pettis, and Pettis just jumped out. And because it was a right hook, it was a Superman hook, he leaped into the plane of Thompson's body and just cracked him across it and just caught him utterly square and just instantly deaded him.
Yeah, at a moment where neither of Stephen Thompson's feet were on the ground. He had no base. He was just in terrible position. Yeah, it very much, that position reminded me of, there's a lot of examples in MMA, like Gustafsson against Rumble, knocked down at a very similar, Nicholas Backstrom against Mike, English fighter, Mike something.
Wilkinson.
Mike Wilkinson, yeah, same thing. You walk in, you overextend on the push kick. Turns out it's the worst position to be in. And Thompson actually did recover, but he was trying to leap out of range and just doesn't, was out of position when he got hit. I also want to add, I don't know why I feel compelled to talk about this, because listeners of the show and readers of my work will know that I very rarely talk about fighters keeping their hands up. I think it's almost all the time just a really trashy, lazy piece of analysis, where there are usually several other, often significantly more impactful elements at play when you look at a knockout and you're like, well, he should have brought that left hand back to his chin. That's why the right hand over the top knocked him out. But here's the thing. Like, it makes sense to have an active lead hand because your left hand is, if you're in an orthodox stance, your left hand is best employed when it's active. That is your first line of defense, is the threat of that hand. It's also how you gather information. It's how you create and exploit reactions from the opponent. Like, the left hand has so much utility when it's active. It makes a lot of sense to have that hand away from your chin. But even I, the please stop saying keep your hands up guy, I have to say, there is not really any good reason not to keep your backhand next to your chin. Like, it just makes sense. Your left shoulder can protect the left side of your face, but if your right hand is floating around your nipple, there is nothing protecting the right side of your jaw. And that's great if you see shit coming, but the shot you don't see coming is the one that knocks you out. And the only thing you can do about a shot you don't see coming is already have something in the way of it. So it just makes sense. And this is, in fact, yes, a good example of someone getting knocked out in part because they had no defense whatsoever the moment somebody got past their distance management. So, yup. What do you feel about Stephen Thompson right now? Is he washed, Phil?
No, he seems like exactly the same guy. He's been knocked down tons of times like this.
He's certainly the same guy. He woke up after Pettis knocked him out and said, "Gee golly, what happened?" So he's definitely the same guy.
Yeah, his response to you've probably seen that thing. It's been shared around on Twitter of the fighters who got knocked out. That is genuinely charming.
It's very charming. Who doesn't like Stephen Thompson? I mean, he seems like a great guy.
So I'm sure he's still very threatened. Like, he's still pretty much the same guy, but it's just going to be impossible for him to make it back to a title, at least at welterweight. He might be able to do it at middleweight.
Do you think it's an indication of his chin fading at all, or do you think it's just...
No, not really. I mean, we've seen, we also called out, I think before the Ferguson fight, that Anthony Pettis is a very underrated puncher.
Yeah, for sure.
And in both of those last two fights, we've kind of seen that that is true. Yes, he is. No, I don't think it really shows that his chin is fading. He is, it's going to be very difficult to tell because he got hit in the worst situation imaginable. Like, if you're seeing people getting knocked out by short shots from people that wouldn't have hurt them before, if you're in Chuck Liddell type territory, then it's very easy to say that this person's chin is gone. But that was not that kind of situation.
No defense, neither hand on the ground. Clearly didn't see the punch coming. It does seem like a recipe for a knockout, even if it didn't look like the greatest punch Pettis has ever thrown. Yeah.
I mean, it did in at least one way. It was a fucking Superman hook off the cage.
It's a very Anthony Pettis way to win. It really is.
Right. I love the way that it was just a fight of the most fundamental kickboxing technique you can imagine, and just leg kick to the front side, body kick to the rear side, and then Superman hook.
The freeze. I just love the freeze from the finish would show two men, neither of whom has even 1 foot on the ground at the point of impact. I'm like, this is some Dragon Ball Z shit. Okay. What about the rest of this card?
Oh man, so bad.
It was not fun to watch. But let's talk about very briefly Curtis Blades, Justin Willis.
Justin Willis is very flat-footed.
Yes.
That turned out to be a bad thing.
Yes. It turns out also that having a similar style to Francis Ngannou does not make you Francis Ngannou. It frustrates me to no end, Phil, to think that the insane recklessness of Ngannou's style is a big part of what makes him such a good foil to Curtis Blades. Just the willingness to just completely sell out 8 weeks of a training camp on the first counterpunch you throw. That will work against Curtis Blades more reliably than Willis's objectively much more calculated brand of counterpunching. But that's the truth. What else? we're moving through them quickly. I will say, momentous occasion. I'm very, very happy for Jussier Formiga, though.
Yeah.
He fought Davison Figueiredo. Most people, including both of us, were expecting Figueiredo to win. I think on this show, we may have said this. If not, I definitely made this comparison elsewhere, that this was the flyweight division's Romero versus Jacare. And this time Jacare won. And it's important to remember, flyweight's not boring, because that fight at middleweight was boring too. Romero got knocked down, or he knocked Jacare down, but most of the rest of it was pretty slow. And really, really tightly contested. And this fight was more or less the same. The main difference is that Figueiredo does not have Yoel Romero's wrestling. And Formiga did a really good job of like controlling him. He understood what was at stake in this matchup. And Formiga was almost certainly going to get cut if he'd lost here. And that fucking sucks for a guy who's been on the cusp of title contention his entire UFC career. So to see him win and defy that fate, it made me feel good.
Yeah, it was just a real slick performance. You know, he didn't overuse the takedowns, didn't exhaust himself fighting the stronger man. You know, his first takedown that he hit was gorgeous. It was beautifully timed. Wasn't, you know, he didn't run to it too early in the fight to let Figueiredo get a handle on his timing. You know, it was just a masterpiece in how to kind of keep a physically superior but technically somewhat raw fighter out of the fight, out of battling his way back in,
and like a perceptive finisher too. Like Figueiredo, the Romero comparison, I continually make it because Figueiredo does have some of that like killer razor focus, where he catches you making mistakes or leaving openings, and he will learn from what you show him. And this was a masterclass in Formiga just not really showing his hand more than he had to beat Figueiredo. He just didn't give him a lot of opportunities to get reads. And what little he did was very effective. In some ways, it was like a Tyron Woodley-esque performance, but in exactly the correct circumstances for it. So, good shit from Formiga. Last thing I want to talk about, very briefly, the women's flyweight fight that opened the main card. Certainly not among the worse fights on this night. In fact, it was easily one of the best. Maycee Barber fought J.J. Aldrich and got really badly pieced up for about the first 6.5 minutes of the fight. Aldrich, I really like J.J. Aldrich. And on the Vivisection last week, I recall saying that like in by some metric at least, J.J. Aldrich is the first kind of good fighter Maycee Barber has fought. And what I probably should have said then is like, she's the first fighter Barber's fought that is like well schooled, that you can say she looks like she's well trained and has an idea of how to technically respond to the vast majority of situations she's going to face in the cage. And that looked like that was playing out in the beginning portions of this fight. Aldrich was just, she knew how to time an opponent. She had defense after she threw. She had counters in her back pocket. The vast majority of her punches were straight. She also knew that she had to pressure Barber. She said that she ain't shit backing up, basically. And, it looked that way. And what do you think of Maycee Barber's comeback after getting beaten up so badly in the first round that she came back in the second to finish J.J. Aldrich?
So in some ways, this was just the narrative of this fight was very exaggerated, because like a lot of people, I thought that Aldrich had a technical edge, like particularly on the feet, just as a visibly much more comfortable pocket boxer. Yeah. But that Barber had an obvious kind of athleticism advantage. As it turned out, like those two things were true, just to like way bigger extents than I thought.
Yeah.
Like going in. And after the fight, I was thinking, like, I guess a few people were better tone down the hype on Maycee Barber a bit, because she really didn't look ready for what Aldrich was throwing at her earlier on in the fight. And it was only just by kind of walking forward and plowing through it that she was able to get her out of there. That, you know, if she's thinking of herself as being, you know, the youngest UFC champion, you know, overtaking John Jones, all this other kind of stuff, right? But I actually listened to the post-fight show, I think the 6th round with Zane Simon, that piece of shit. And despite being a son of a bitch, he had a really good point. Like,
I'm going to have to censor this.
What, for Zane having a good point? Yeah.
I'm just going to have a long bleep while you explain what Zane's had to say.
Yeah, I mean, he basically said Maycee Barber is less than 2 years into her career.
Uh-huh.
And what we should expect to be seeing from her should at least be somewhat realistic.
Yeah.
And that is true. I mean, we really shouldn't expect her to be a very good striker at this point. I mean, Ronda was, on her way to winning the Strikeforce belt, I think, around this point in her career. But the women's division, the women's bantamweight division, was simply not at the level that even strawweight is now.
There wasn't even a JJ Aldrich available. And Aldrich is far from the best fighter at this weight.
Yeah, the level of technical growth in the women's game has been staggering since that point. So what Barber showed from someone that inexperienced is all just really impressive, to be honest. It's just, she realized that in this particular dynamic, being pushed backwards, she was in serious trouble. And so she said, I got to turn it around, and she pushed forwards. And then she hurt Aldrich and then finished her off really just summarily by the cage.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's all good stuff. She's going to have, it brings forward the fact she is obviously going to have a bad loss sometime in her near future because there just aren't that many fights in this division. She's going to get put in way over her head way early. But she's still got a tremendous future.
She's going to be fighting like Joanne Calderwood or something in her next fight. No doubt. They're going to rush her. They've already picked up on we have a young, energetic, nominally good-looking woman. We know what the UFC loves to do with them, which is to drown them in makeup and then make them read an awkward ad about some shitty movie no one will see in between two other fights. But yeah, I'm glad you said all of that because I had a similar reaction where I felt like everyone's been really hard on Maycee Barber. They expected her to be better at boxing. This fight, and I'm glad you said it, basically this was a fight of those two extreme poles, more extreme than any of us expected them to be. I think most of it comes down to just good game planning from JJ Aldrich. I didn't expect her to be that aggressive. And she knew that's where Barber was weak and very clearly demonstrated that. Was uncharacteristically aggressive in how she approached this fight from the beginning. So I think that had a lot to do with emphasizing just how much more work Barber does have to do on her striking. But then also I didn't expect Barber to be really good in those areas, and she got to show something that we have not seen from her before, which is, yes, it's a fairly simple adjustment when you're the better athlete to just decide to knuckle down and fight back. But that's a really, really important characteristic for fighters to have. I don't know that Ronda Rousey ever demonstrated the ability to fight back. Certainly not to fight back en route to a victory. She just never. And here we saw Maycee Barber fight back. It's a very important characteristic for a fighter to have.
BJ. I don't think BJ Penn ever lost an early round and then came back to win one late.
Right. It's not something you want to rely on. And yes, it did demonstrate a lot of holes in her game, but it allowed her to show that when the chips are down, she can say all right, this isn't going to be easy, but I'm going to have to just fight my way through this and hope that I can find a win. And she did. And yeah, that's a good sign for a young developing fighter. It's only unfortunate for her that she's already in the UFC because they're not going to take it slowly. She's probably going to have that prospect loss very soon unless she makes a big camp switch and rapidly starts improving her boxing fundamentals. But I don't see this as a negative outcome at all for Maycee Barber in what she was able to show in this performance. She got pieced up in a way that you would expect from an unexpectedly aggressive JJ Aldrich, and then she showed real heart and also what looked like a decent amount of power as she was fighting back as well. So, yeah, Maycee Barber was not to like, man. It's you got a young female Rory McDonald thing going on. It's fun. And it was a good performance. And that's about it for what I want to talk about on this card. Again, Chito Vera knocked the dude out. Woo! And that's pretty much it. That's it for this week's episode of Heavy Hands. Phil, you have anything coming out this week?
Nope, just a preview. So we're going to be breaking down Gaethje Barboza.
Cool. I don't know if I have anything coming out this week. I should, but we'll see what it is. There's no telling just yet. So no promises, no expectations. Everyone please leave me alone until next week, when we will be back with another episode of Heavy Hands. Before that, make sure to find us on social media. Twitter is usually the best place for the both of us. You can find Phil on there at Evil Greg Jackson, and myself at Boxing Bush, BUSCH. And otherwise, that's it for this week's episode of Heavy Hands. Until next time, if you came here today for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.